Number 1, Amber McLaughlin. Amber McLaughlin was 49 years old at the time of her execution and had spent nearly 2 decades on Missouri's death row. Formerly known as Scott McLaughlin, she worked various prison jobs while incarcerated and was publicly identified as shy and reserved before fully living openly as Amber. Raised amid trauma, exposed to alcohol before birth, placed in foster care, where she endured neglect and abusive treatment from caregivers and even her adoptive police officer father, she struggled academically and emotionally from early childhood. Reports noted her IQ placed in the borderline to low range, and school records documented multiple incidents of abuse or neglect. As a transgender woman, Amber began transitioning inside prison in her mid-40s, supported in part by Jessica Hicklin, a former inmate who mentored other trans prisoners. Though she was diagnosed with gender dysphoria, she never received hormone treatments. That transition seemed to help her emerge from a shell. Hicklin recalled Amber's shy nature giving way to a person who cracked dad jokes and smiled more openly. In 2003, McLaughlin stalked and murdered her former girlfriend, Beverly Gunther, aged 45, in suburban St. Louis. According to court records, Amber repeatedly showed up at Gunther's workplace, leading to a restraining order. On November 20th, Gunther disappeared, and a broken knife handle and trail of blood near her car prompted a police search. The next day, Amber led authorities to the victim's body near the Mississippi River. While the method was stabbing, the emphasis and descriptions focused on pattern and psychological context rather than explicit violence. Authorities arrested McLaughlin soon after. In 2006, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by a judge after the jury deadlocked on whether to impose capital punishment. Missouri law allowed the judge to make that decision. Her case drew media attention not only due to the crime, but also because she was openly transgender. At one point, her death sentence was vacated and replaced with life in prison in 2016, but in 2021, a federal appeals court reversed that and reinstated the death penalty. In September of that year, the Missouri Supreme Court issued her execution warrant. Amber McLaughlin was executed on January 3, 2023, at the Eastern Reception and Diagnostic Correction Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. She died via lethal injection of pentobarbital at 6:39 p.m. in a small white execution room, accompanied by her spiritual advisor, Reverend Lauren Bennett, who held her hand and tried to comfort her as she reportedly expressed physical pain in her final moments. Her last meal was described as simple, but telling a cheeseburger, French fries, a strawberry milkshake, and peanut M&Ms, a request that underscored a longing for basic comfort in her final hours. In her written final statement, she offered apology and self-perception. "I am sorry for what I did. I am a loving and caring person." She signed off softly and was pronounced dead a few minutes after injection. Mental health professionals who reviewed her background noted the lifelong trauma, including prenatal alcohol exposure, early childhood abuse, pervasive neglect, multiple suicide attempts, and untreated dysphoria. Her legal team had submitted a clemency petition highlighting these factors, arguing she never had a chance and had been failed by institutions meant to protect her. Advocate Jessica Hicklin stressed that while the harm Amber caused was real, execution was not the only response society could craft, suggesting redemption and healing remained possible even for condemned individuals. In the final scene of her life, Amber McLaughlin lay strapped to the gurney under a white linen, breathing heavily, her spiritual advisor stroking her hand and whispering solace. She reportedly murmured, "It hurts," before closing her eyes. Reverend Bennett later described feeling bitter mourning that Amber's death had been physically painful, not peaceful. Yet Bennett also spoke of a halo of pink at sunset, a comfort aligned with Amber's favorite color, a final symbol of the peace she longed for. Amber McLaughlin's story forces us to reckon with trauma, identity, justice, and regret. Condemned for committing a violent crime, she was also shaped by layers of suffering many never saw. Her final words, both apology and self-image, as a loving and caring person linger hauntingly, inviting viewers to ask, what is justice when anguish is lifelong? Number 2, Lisa Marie Montgomery. Lisa Marie Montgomery was 52 at the time of her execution, and had lived a life scarred by trauma long before her crime. Born in Kansas with severe brain damage likely caused by prenatal alcohol exposure, she endured relentless abuse through her childhood sexual trafficking by her mother incest gang, rapes by men in her family, and neighbors' systemic neglect and emotional torment beginning at age 11. Diagnosed later with borderline personality disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and pseudopsoriasis, a delusional belief she was pregnant, she became emotionally fragmented and dissociated from reality. In December 2004, the troubled 36-year-old contacted Bobby Joe Stinnett, a 23-year-old dog breeder in Skidmore, Missouri, under the pretense she wanted to buy a puppy. After arriving at Bobby Joe's home, Lisa strangled her, cut the unborn baby from her womb, and kidnapped the infant, all in an ostensible attempt to claim the child as her own, convinced she was pregnant herself. The baby survived and was returned safely to her father. Though the act was brutal in outcome, the narrative remains focused on psychological pulls, not graphic detail. Montgomery was arrested the next day in Kansas. The crime crossed state lines, so she was charged under federal kidnapping statutes. At trial, federal prosecutors argued meticulously planned violence, referencing her online research into crude C-sections and her stalking behaviors. Defense experts testified that she suffered from pseudopsoriasis and profound delusional dissociation rooted in lifelong trauma and brain injury. In October 2007, jurors found her guilty, rejecting the mental illness defense, and recommended the death penalty. A federal judge formally sentenced her in April 2008. Her legal team mounted appeals arguing her severe mental illness and undertreated neurological conditions rendered her incompetent for execution, an Eighth Amendment concern. Courts at multiple levels, including temporary stays, and the United States Supreme Court dissented on the grounds she lacked rational comprehension. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court allowed the execution to proceed late in January 2021 during a wave of federal executions under the Trump administration. Lisa Marie Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at United States Penitentiary Terre Haute in Indiana shortly after midnight on January 13, 2021. She was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. When asked if she had any final words, she replied simply, "Well, this marked the first federal execution of a woman in nearly 70 years. Unlike many, no public record indicates a last meal request." Her final statement also offered no apology or message. The silence stood in stark contrast to her turbulent life, a woman with shattered cognition, unable to fully grasp the reason for her execution, according to her defense team. Throughout the case, advocates emphasized that her childhood suffering was inseparable from her crime. Experts described her as psychologically broken before birth and with no meaningful intervention by social systems that might have changed her trajectory. Mental health professionals argued Montgomery was in such deep dissociation that she did not understand the implications of her sentence. In the days before execution, her attorneys and hundreds of advocacy groups spanning prosecutors, anti-trafficking advocates, mental health organizations, and child protection groups petitioned for clemency, insisting cruelty rather than justice, motivated the federal government's push to kill a profoundly traumatized woman before a presidential transition. Her story challenges viewers to consider the boundaries between victim and perpetrator sanity and culpability and justice and mercy. Without explicit final words or a recorded meal, the emptiness of her last public act saying no when asked to speak echoes beyond the cell. What does it mean to execute someone who experts say cannot fully understand her fate?
I love you, Sally. And I love you, Susan. You let my kids know I went out singing Amazing Grace. amazing man lost his life because of me. And if I could take it back, if this would change it, I would have done it a long time ago. But it's not. And I just hope they find peace. And I hope they find some happiness. God bless you.
Number 3, Kelly Renee Gissendaner. Kelly Renee Gissendaner was 47 when she became the first woman executed in Georgia in nearly 70 years. Born Kelly Renee Brookshire on March 8, 1968 in Lawrenceville, Georgia, she grew up in poverty on her family's cotton farm. Her childhood was marred by abuse, molested by her stepfather, and other men date raped as a teen, and struggling emotionally through dysfunctional relationships. Described as charming and charismatic, she nonetheless longed for stability and affection, often making impulsive choices in love as she carried deep emotional wounds. By her 20s, Kelly had married twice and had 3 children. Her marriage to Douglas Gissendaner in 1989 eventually fell apart under strain, but they remarried in 1995. In the years leading up to 1997, she felt trapped financial concerns, a desire for security, and a persistent affair with a younger man. Gregory Owen compounded her sense of desperation. Owen, a friend-turned-lover, became central to Kelly's plan to escape her life. On the evening of February 7th, 1997, Gregory Owen abducted Douglas at knife point as he arrived home, forcing him into his car and driving him to a wooded area in Gwinnett County. There, Owen struck him and stabbed him multiple times. Kelly arrived later, watched from the car, and then helped burn Douglas's truck to fabricate a robbery scene. Prosecutors argued that Kelly orchestrated the murder to collect insurance money and gain ownership of their house motivations, fueled by jealousy and a desperate longing for control. The victim, Douglas Gissendaner, was a 30-year-old Army veteran described by friends and family as kind and hardworking. He had no warning of the betrayal awaiting him. After his disappearance, Kelly publicly pleaded for his return, an emotional performance that belied her guilt. She continued to insist she had no involvement even after Gregory Owen confessed, admitting she had first approached him months earlier about getting rid of Doug, if necessary. Police arrested Kelly on February 25th, 1997, after tracing phone records that documented dozens of calls between her and Owen. At trial, Owen testified under a plea deal in which he received life with parole eligibility. Kelly rejected a similar offer. In November 1998, the jury convicted her of malice murder and felony murder. She was sentenced to death in Georgia's first capital case against a woman in decades, the jury taking just 2 hours to decide. While on death row, Kelly underwent a dramatic transformation. She embraced Christianity, mentoring other inmates and pursuing theology studies via Emory University. She engaged spiritually with students and clergy, authored theological essays, and gained support from prison staff and religious leaders who saw her capacity for genuine change. Her appeals and final clemency plea became widely publicized. Influential voices, including former Georgia Supreme Court Chief Justice Norman Fletcher, Pope Francis, and numerous evangelical and legal advocates, urged mercy, arguing her remorse, spiritual growth, and nonviolent role in the murder made execution disproportionate. But on September 29, 2015, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied her request. The state Supreme Court refused to intervene. Kelly Gissendaner was executed by lethal injection at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson shortly after midnight on September 30th, 2015. She received a large, varied last meal, 2 cheeseburgers, 2 large orders of French fries, cornbread salad with eggs and vegetables, popcorn, cherry vanilla ice cream, and lemonade, her choice significantly pared back from her request the previous scheduled date when she had eaten nearly all she ordered. As lethal injection took effect at 12:21 a.m., Kelly cried, prayed, and sang "Amazing Grace," her final words delivered softly to her attorney, and the Gissendaner family were heartfelt and repentant. Tell the Gissendaner family I am so sorry that amazing man lost his life because of me. And if I could take it back, if this would change it, I would have done it a long time ago. I just hope they can find peace, and I hope they find some happiness. God bless you. She also spoke tenderly to her lawyer, I love you, Susan. Kelly's story is a study, in contrast, a mother mentor and convicted murderer shaped by trauma, infidelity, and desperation. Her reformed spirit behind bars, juxtaposed with the cold calculus of capital punishment, raises deep questions when justice demands execution of someone who did not physically wield the knife and who years later embraced faith and service. What does mercy look like? In her final act, she left a plea woven not with anger or denial, but with sorrow and a voice seeking redemption. Her words echo as both confession and an inquiry. What is justice when remorse and transformation arrive too late to save a life? Number 4, Lisa Ann Coleman. Lisa Ann Coleman was 38 when she became only the 6th woman executed in Texas since capital punishment resumed in 1982. A laborer living in Arlington, she shared an apartment with her girlfriend, Marcella Williams, and Marcella's 9-year-old son, Davante Marcel Williams. Publicly, Coleman was a quiet background figure, described by neighbors as reserved, not violent, and not previously suspected of cruelty. Her psychological triggers remained difficult to fully understand. The household where she lived had been the subject of multiple child abuse investigations before Davante's death. Marcella's son suffered from behavioral issues and frequent illnesses. Coleman's own background included periods of instability and stress. Her defense later argued that dealing with Davante's special needs overwhelmed both women, though prosecutors maintained that neglect turned into deliberate harm. On July the 26th, 2004, emergency services found Davante unconscious in his apartment. He was severely underweight, about 35 pounds, roughly half the typical weight of a 9-year-old, and suffered from pneumonia as well as numerous injuries, including burns and scars. The cause of death was ruled malnutrition, with pneumonia as a contributing condition. Soon after, police arrested both women. Coleman refused to accept a plea deal that could have spared her life, while Marcella Williams accepted a life sentence and parole eligibility decades later. Coleman's trial in 2006 resulted in a capital murder conviction. Prosecutors emphasized that the death occurred during a kidnapping aggravator, even though the child resided in the same apartment, arguing that death during concealment or restraint qualified under Texas law. At trial, Coleman maintained her innocence of capital murder, while experts for the defense cited lack of intent and argued that her partner had primary responsibility. The jury, after deliberating, sentenced her to death. That sentence was affirmed on appeal, and federal courts, including the United States Supreme Court, declined to intervene. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles refused clemency. On the evening of September 17th, 2014, Coleman entered the death chamber at a Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. She was executed by lethal injection of pentobarbital at 6:24 p.m. Central Time. Before the drugs took effect, she smiled, nodded to friends and family watching behind glass, and mouthed a kiss, expressing a calm composure. Her final words were brief, but poignant. Love you all. 12 minutes later, she was pronounced dead. Unlike many others, Coleman did not have a publicly recorded last meal request, and she delivered no written statement. In the silence of her final moments, her simple final utterance resonated more than any lengthy reflection could. Psychologists reviewing the case noted that, while Davante's suffering was real and inexcusable, overlapping systemic failures and emotional exhaustion likely influenced Coleman's behavior. Her attorneys argued that she was poor Black and lesbian factors that influenced both prosecution focus and clemency denial. Advocacy groups later suggested that the application of the death penalty in her case reflected patterns of bias rather than proportional justice. Lisa Ann Coleman's story forces us to confront disturbing questions. A child died. Systemic neglect, violence, and decision-making within a home led to tragedy. A woman paid with her life despite pleading for mercy. Her last words, "Love you all," echo not a confession, but a frail attempt at connection. What is justice when the system punishes emotional collapse as capital crime, when the human failings behind a death sentence are rooted in fear, exhaustion, and isolation? Her execution stands as a stark testament to tragedy. More than a crime, it is a cautionary tale about vulnerability, accountability, and the cost of silence. Number 5, Suzanne Margaret. Suzanne Margaret Sue Basso, age 59 at execution, grew up in Schenectady, New York, as one of 8 children. Her upbringing was steeped in poverty and abuse, physically disciplined and sexually abused by family members. Her mother was the sister of a notorious serial rapist, casting a long shadow over her family background. Basso trained as a seamstress and worked security at an apartment complex before moving to Jacinto City, a suburb of Houston, where her life took a darker turn. By the late 1990s, Basso had become entangled in dysfunctional relationships, including one with her adult son's friend, James J.D. O'Malley. In August 1998, she befriended 59-year-old Louis Buddy Musso, a mentally disabled man from New Jersey whom she claimed she would marry. She and O'Malley, along with several accomplices, lured Musso to Texas. Prosecutors alleged the motive was insurance money, though there was no actual policy payout. She reportedly orchestrated a group assault. Musso was beaten with bats, steel-toed boots, belts, and fists over several hours until he died, his body later left in a ditch outside Houston. Though Basso did not physically attack him, prosecutors depicted her as the mastermind directing the brutal abuse to secure financial gain. Investigators arrested Basso and 5 others. She was tried in Harris County in 1999, convicted of capital murder during the course of kidnapping. The penalty phase revealed that her defense failed to present any mitigating evidence, no testimony about her abusive childhood, her history of mental illness, or delusional thinking. Her attorneys offered almost no background context. In October 1999, the jury unanimously recommended death, and she was formally sentenced later that month. Over the next decade, Basso's legal team filed appeals, arguing diminished mental capacity, delusional disorders, incompetency to be executed, and procedural failures at trial. Her lawyers described her as suffering long-standing delusions and mental illness and criticized the medical examiner's unreliable testimony. They argued she had not received a fair trial, yet courts, including the United States Supreme Court, declined to intervene, rejecting her final appeals in early February 2014. Suzanne Basso was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on February 5, 2014. The lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered at 6:15 p.m. Central Time. She appeared to breathe heavily and fight tears, then looked toward the witness chamber, smiled-mouthed, bye to a friend, nodded, and lay down calmly. 11 minutes later, at 6:26 p.m., she was pronounced dead. When asked if she wanted to make a final statement, she told the warden simply, "No, sir." She made no further comment. Because Texas abolished special last meal requests in 2011, Basso received the standard prison meal on execution night typical fare, such as oven-roasted chicken eggs, vegetables, and bread. No personal menu was recorded in her case. Mental health professionals who later analyzed the case emphasized Basso's deeply disturbed psychological profile. Born into abuse, she likely developed coping mechanisms rooted in delusion and manipulation. Her attorneys presented no mitigating context at trial, and the jury remained unaware of her long history of trauma. Experts argued that while the murder was tragic and unjustifiable, Basso's mental state rendered her execution constitutionally and morally problematic. She was among only 14 women executed in modern United States history, and the third woman executed in Texas since 2002, illustrating both the rarity and severity of her sentence. Suzanne Basso's story poses gut-wrenching questions. A vulnerable, abused child becomes a calculating adult who draws others into violence. She never raised a hand in the fatal assault, yet orchestrated it. Her final act, a quiet refusal to speak, felt more chilling than any confession. In her last visible moments, she offered a faint goodbye instead of apology or explanation. Her execution forces viewers to wrestle with the uneasy intersection of victimhood and culpability trauma and retribution. What is justice when the architect of a heinous deed arose from unspeakable pain? Suzanne Basso died without words, leaving behind a chilling silence that underscores her life's tragedy more than any final confession could. Number 6. Kimberly LaGayle McCarthy. Kimberly LaGayle McCarthy was 52 years old when she was executed, becoming the 500th person put to death in Texas since the state reinstated capital punishment in 1982. Born in 1961, in Greenville, Texas, Kimberly's childhood was ordinary on the surface. She excelled academically, earned a nursing degree, and for a time led a stable, productive life as a professional nurse. But behind the exterior of success, Kimberly struggled with deep-seated personal battles. Friends described her as charismatic, but troubled. She faced failed marriages and spiraled into substance abuse. Cocaine addiction eroded her career and relationships, pushing her into cycles of desperation that would culminate in a shocking crime. By the early 1990s, Kimberly's life had unraveled. Her addiction fueled financial instability and impulsive behavior. Court records and psychological evaluations suggested she was intelligent but manipulative, capable of masking inner turmoil with charm. It was in this fractured state that she encountered her eventual victim, Dorothy Booth. Dorothy was a 71-year-old retired college professor and therapist living in Lancaster, Texas. Known for her kindness and generosity, Booth had previously offered help to people in need, including Kimberly, who lived nearby. On July the 21st, 1997, Kimberly went to Booth's home under the pretense of borrowing a cup of sugar. What unfolded next shocked the community. Kimberly attacked Booth in her own home, stole her credit cards, and took her car. The motive prosecutors later argued was driven by drug addiction and financial need. Among the stolen items was Booth's wedding ring, which Kimberly pawned the same day. Authorities would later link her not only to Booth's murder, but also through forensic evidence to 2 additional elderly women killed in the Dallas area. During the same period, though, she was never prosecuted for those cases. Police apprehended Kimberly within days. Evidence against her was compelling pawn slips, stolen property, and blood evidence tied her to the crime scene. During her trial in 1998, prosecutors presented a narrative of premeditation and exploitation of trust. The victim, an elderly woman living alone, was portrayed as particularly vulnerable, while Kimberly's addiction was framed as both motive and aggravating factor. The jury deliberated only a short time before convicting her of capital murder and sentencing her to death. The case drew significant attention not just for its brutality, but also for broader questions of race and the death penalty. Kimberly, an African-American woman, was sentenced in Dallas County, a jurisdiction criticized for disproportionately seeking death against minority defendants. Civil rights advocates later argued that racial bias and ineffective counsel contributed to her sentence. Her appeals spanned over a decade, citing these concerns, as well as procedural errors in her history of drug addiction. Courts, however, consistently upheld the conviction and sentence. After multiple reprieves and last-minute stays, Kimberly's execution date was set for June 26, 2013, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Unlike many inmates, she declined to request a special last meal. When asked if she had final words, she used the opportunity to speak of faith and reconciliation. She thanked her supporters, expressed love to her family, and said she was going to be with Jesus, hoping for forgiveness for all involved. Witnesses described her demeanor as calm and resigned as the lethal injection was administered. She was pronounced dead. At 6:37 p.m., psychologists analyzing Kimberly's case later highlighted the intersection of personal trauma, drug addiction, and impulsive decision-making. They noted that while her actions were undeniably horrific, her trajectory was shaped by cycles of abuse and self-destruction rather than sheer malice. Her case also reignited debates about how society handles offenders whose crimes are intertwined with substance dependency and mental health struggles. Kimberly LaGayle McCarthy's story remains haunting, not only for the loss of Dorothy Booth's life, but also for the stark transformation of a promising nurse into a condemned murderer. It is a cautionary tale of addiction's corrosive power and the irreversible consequences of a single desperate act. Her final words, seeking peace and forgiveness, linger as a somber reminder of the humanity that can still exist within those society deems irredeemable. Number 7, Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis was 41 years old when she became the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century and the only woman executed in the United States in 2010. Born in Danville, Virginia in 1969, Teresa grew up in poverty. Both her parents worked in a textile mill. She dropped out of school at 16, married young, and had a daughter. Later, she struggled with alcohol, painkillers, and unstable relationships, drawing comments from family members about her mental stability. In 2000, Teresa married widower Julian Lewis, moving in with him and his 3 children. In December 2001, his eldest son died in a car accident, which resulted in a life insurance payout to the family. Soon after, Julian's younger son, Charles, a United States Army reservist preparing for deployment, took out a $250,000 policy naming Teresa as the secondary beneficiary. By late 2002, Teresa had become involved with 2 much younger men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, whom she had met at a Walmart. Prosecutors asserted she offered them sex gifts and a share of the insurance money to murder her husband and stepson. On the night of October 30th, 2002, they entered the Lewis trailer. A door Teresa had unlocked shot Julian and Charles in their sleep and then waited before calling for help. While doing so, Teresa removed money from her husband's wallet and distributed cash to the killers even before emergency responders arrived. Authorities arrested Teresa within days. Evidence included her forged checks attempting to withdraw large sums and her eventual confession that she had orchestrated the killings for the life insurance. During the trial, the judge labeled her the head of this serpent and ruled her the mastermind of a capital murder-for-hire conspiracy. Forensic psychiatrists testified she had a full-scale IQ around 72, and evidence also showed she suffered from dependent personality disorder and opioid addiction, placing her near the borderline for intellectual disability. Meanwhile, her co-defendant Schallenberger carried an IQ well above average, suggesting a striking imbalance of influence within the crime. Teresa pleaded guilty to capital murder in May 2003, avoiding a jury trial, but allowed a judge to impose the death sentence based on the gravity of the offense. Her co-conspirators received life sentences in return for cooperation. Despite prosecutorial configuration, her defense mounted appeals for over 7 years, arguing her mental capacity should exempt her from execution. The governor of Virginia received thousands of clemency letters, but ultimately denied any reprieve. The United States Supreme Court also declined to intervene, though 2 justices publicly stated they would have granted a stay. Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center near Jarrett, Virginia, on September 23, 2010. At 9:13 p.m., she became only the 12th woman executed in the United States since 1976 and the first in Virginia since 1912. She requested a final meal of fried chicken breasts, sweet peas with butter, a slice of apple pie, or German cake for dessert, and a Dr. Pepper. During her final hours, she spent time praying, singing hymns, and meeting with her chaplain and attorney. She appeared fearful while walking into the chamber, and when asked for a last statement, she softly said, "I want Kathy to know I love you, and I am very sorry." She was pronounced dead less than 6 minutes later. Psychologists later emphasized Teresa's intellectual limitations, chronic dependency, and emotional vulnerability. Though undeniably culpable, many observers questioned whether she truly understood the full consequences of her actions. Advocates, including authors, legal professionals, and members of the faith community, argued that capital punishment was unduly harsh for someone described as near intellectually disabled and emotionally manipulated by stronger personalities. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis's life and death continued to spark debate about justice, mercy, and culpability. She never wielded the gun, yet bore the weight of its consequences. Her final words, a simple apology, and the haunting silence in her final act underscore a troubling question. When mental incapacity intersects with deliberate harm, is execution ever just? Number 8, Frances Elaine Newton. Frances Elaine Newton was born Frances Elaine McLemore on April 12, 1965, in Harris County, Texas. By the age of 22, when the murders occurred, she was a young mother, estranged wife, and occasional employee who had previously faced a forgery conviction and lost a job for theft. Known by neighbors as quiet and somewhat reserved, Frances had a history of marital difficulties with her husband Adrian and was often perceived as protective of her children, yet emotionally withdrawn. In the years leading up to the events of April 7, 1987, Frances's life was marked by tension reports suggest an abusive or at least troubled marriage while she battled shame over prior legal trouble. She was trying to provide for her young family and mental stress. Shame and fear may have weighed heavily on her. While there is no formal psychiatric diagnosis, repeated themes in her appeals and coverage hint that trauma and situational pressures, plus possibly untreated mental health challenges, created a fertile ground for crisis. On the night of April 7, 1987, at about 8:27 p.m., a Houston deputy was dispatched to Frances's apartment complex. Inside, Frances and her cousin Sandra Nelms discovered the bodies of Adrian Newton, 23, shot in the head, their 7-year-old son Alton, and 21-month-old daughter Farah, both shot in the chest. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Sandra testified that Frances had shortly before placed a paper bag containing a gun in another house. The prosecution claimed Frances had used a .25 caliber pistol belonging to a man she was dating and had hidden it afterward. The victims were her own family, her husband, and 2 children, a relationship context that added horrific emotional weight. Prosecutors argued Frances took out life insurance policies on her husband and daughter just 3 weeks prior, naming herself beneficiary, forging Adrian's signature to keep him from discovering it. They presented this as a clear financial motive. During the investigation, ballistics testing linked the bullets to the gun found, and trace evidence nitrites on the front of Frances's skirt was introduced, though her defense argued the particles could have come from fertilizer from a relative's garden during childcare. Frances was arrested and tried in 1988. The trial relied on circumstantial case ballistics, life insurance motive, and witness testimony about the gun and hidden bag. Her legal representation was widely criticized as ineffective. Investigators later noted possible suppression of a second gun that may have been at the scene, which her court-appointed attorney failed to pursue. After a lengthy trial on October 25, 1988, Frances Newton was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the verdict. The United States Supreme Court denied certiorari. Over the years on death row, Frances maintained her innocence firmly. She claimed a drug dealer named Cheryle committed the killings over a debt Adrian allegedly owed, a claim that friends and family disputed. In December 2004, Governor Rick Perry granted a last-minute 120-day reprieve to allow retesting of forensic evidence using new technology. State lab issues and contamination ultimately prevented conclusive retests, though later ballistic testing reaffirmed the connection to her gun. Several jurors later said they would not have voted to convict had they known about the withheld evidence and contamination issues. Despite appeals and mounting questions, courts repeatedly denied her motions. Federal and state appeals failed, and both the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and Governor Perry rejected calls for clemency in September 2005. On September 14, 2005, Frances Elaine Newton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 40 years old, having spent nearly 18 years on death row. She was the third woman executed in modern Texas and the first black woman since the Civil War. She made no last meal request and declined to give any final words when offered. Instead, the warden asked if she wished to speak. She shook her head quietly, said no, and turned her gaze toward her family. As the drugs were administered, she coughed once and gasped. 8 minutes later, she was pronounced dead. She briefly appeared to try to mouth something to her relatives before losing consciousness. Psychological analysis of Frances's motives remains speculative. Prosecutors emphasized greed and cold calculation, while supporters and some jurors later raised concerns about inadequate defense potential lab error and withheld evidence. Some theories suggest she may have acted under extreme psychological duress, poverty-driven desperation, and fear, possibly combined with trauma and personality traits that impaired her response to crisis. No formal expert psychiatric profile is publicly documented, though decades later, critics highlighted mental health and legal systemic failures as potential factors. In reflection, Frances Newton's case invites chilling questions: a young mother convicted of killing her own family, insisting until the end on her innocence, in a legal system that may have failed her. Whether one views her as a cold-blooded killer or possibly a tragically wronged woman, her story lingers as a narrative of emotional weight, legal frailty, and the irreversible finality of capital punishment. Number 9, Aileen Carol Wuornos. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born Aileen Carol Pittman on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. By the time of her arrest on January 9, 1991, at age 35, she was known across Florida as a transient sex worker who drifted along the state's highways, surviving through prostitution. Her early life was marked by abandonment. Her teenage mother relinquished her and her brother to their grandparents, who she later discovered were actually her biological parents. Reports describe physical and sexual abuse, neglect, early promiscuity exchanged for food or cigarettes, and self-harm starting in childhood behaviors that reflected deep trauma and emotional disturbance. By adolescence, Aileen had dropped out of school, become pregnant at 14, and surrendered her child for adoption. She cycled through juvenile detention, substance abuse, theft, forgery, and armed robbery arrests. In 1986, she met Teresa Moore, and the two formed a turbulent but intense relationship that became central to her later life. Between November 1989 and November 1990, while hitchhiking and engaging in sex work in Florida, Wuornos fatally shot 7 men she claimed had attacked or attempted to rape her. She admitted to 6 of the killings. Investigators suspected a 7th. The victims included electronics store owner Richard Mallory, retired police chief Charles Dick Humphreys, construction worker David Spear salesman, Troy Burress trucker Walter Antonio, and others. None had personal connections to Wuornos beyond brief encounters. She insisted in interviews and confessions that every killing was an act of self-defense driven by fear and emotional turmoil. The investigation began tightening around her after she and Moore were spotted abandoning a victim's car. Fingerprint evidence and pawned belongings helped link her to multiple murders. Police arrested Wuornos at a biker bar in Volusia County, Florida. Teresa Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity and helped authorities obtain a taped confession from Wuornos on January 16, 1991. In it, Wuornos calmly described each killing, maintaining her claims of self-defense. Her first trial in early 1992 centered on the murder of Richard Mallory. Prosecutors used evidence from her other alleged murders to establish a pattern, arguing that she was a calculating killer who murdered for profit. Defense attorneys presented psychiatric testimony diagnosing borderline and antisocial personality disorders, pointing to a lifetime of abuse and instability. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death. Over the following months, Wuornos pleaded guilty or no contest in several other cases, receiving 6 death sentences in total. Media coverage painted her as the damsel of death or highway killer, a label that made her both infamous and a subject of public fascination. Documentaries and later the film Monster further amplified her story, while advocacy groups debated whether she was a victim of systemic failure or an unrepentant predator. On death row, Wuornos declined further appeals. In 2001, she wrote to the courts, stating she was competent, understood her actions, and wished to end all legal proceedings. She openly admitted she hated human life and would likely kill again if released, describing herself as fully aware and ready for execution. Psychiatrists ultimately agreed she was mentally ill, yet legally sane. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9th, 2002 at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. She refused a special last meal, asking only for a single cup of coffee. In her final moments, she delivered a cryptic statement. "I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. Big mothership and all. I'll be back." Witnesses described the moment as haunting, blending religious and science fiction imagery in a way that reflected her fractured mental state. After her execution, her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in Michigan by her childhood friend, fulfilling her final wish. Psychological assessments later highlighted her high psychopathy score, combined with borderline and antisocial traits, framing her case as one of the most complex intersections of trauma, mental illness, and violent criminality in modern American history. In the end, Aileen Wuornos' story raises enduring questions. Was she a brutal predator who preyed on strangers, or a woman molded by abuse and abandonment who lashed out in terror? Her final words linger, a chilling echo of defiance and delusion, leaving behind a legacy that forces reflection on justice trauma and the irreversible finality of execution. Number 10, Lynda Cheryle Lyon Block. Lynda Cheryle Lyon Block was born on February 8, 1948 in Orlando, Florida. By the time of her crime and arrest in October 1993, she was 45 years old. In her earlier years, Lynda projected the image of a community-minded woman. She was active in civic life in Key West, volunteered at the local Humane Society, served as president of the Friends of the Library, and even published a libertarian political newsletter. To those around her, she appeared civic-minded and passionate, though privately she harbored deep distrust toward authority. Her childhood had been fractured. She lost her father when she was 10, and later described her mother as abusive, both physically and emotionally. This environment, combined with repeated feelings of abandonment, left her with lasting scars and mistrust of institutions. In adulthood, her life was defined by a series of failed relationships and a growing anti-government ideology. By the early 1990s, she had renounced United States citizenship, declaring that courts and police had no authority over her life. Her second husband, George Sibley, shared these beliefs and became her constant companion. On October 4th, 1993, Lynda and Sibley were in a parked car in Opelika, Alabama, with Lynda's 9-year-old son. A passerby concerned about the child called police. Sergeant Roger Lamar Motley Jr. approached to investigate. Accounts suggest a tense confrontation followed. Sibley drew a weapon when he believed the officer reached for his own gun. Lynda, who had been at a nearby payphone, ran toward them and opened fire as well. Officer Motley was fatally wounded in the exchange. Forensic evidence later indicated both Sibley and Lynda fired shots, though it could not be determined whose bullet caused the fatal injury. They claimed they acted in self-defense, insisting they feared unlawful harm at the hands of police. Authorities quickly tracked the pair. They were fugitives already facing legal trouble in Florida. After a short pursuit, they were arrested and charged with capital murder, as the killing of a police officer in Alabama carries the death penalty. Lynda refused court-appointed attorneys, declaring the court had no jurisdiction over her, and chose to represent herself. This defiance continued through trial and appeals, where she consistently rejected legal assistance, waiving nearly every safeguard available to her. Prosecutors argued that the shooting was deliberate, presenting eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence linking her to the officer's death. They described her as an anti-government extremist who posed a danger to anyone in authority. The defense highlighted her traumatic past and intense mistrust of institutions, portraying her as fearful rather than malicious. The jury convicted her of capital murder, and in December 1994, she was sentenced to death. Lynda spent the next 8 years on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. She refused to pursue appeals, remaining steadfast in her belief that acknowledging the court's authority would betray her principles. Psychological assessments suggested a rigid worldview shaped by lifelong trauma and a hardened distrust of authority figures. Friends described her as intelligent and articulate, yet deeply isolated by her convictions. In May 2002, Alabama executed Lynda Lyon Block in the state's electric chair, known as Yellow Mama. Although lethal injection had become the default method, her conviction predated the law change, and she had not chosen injection. She made no request for a final meal and declined to give last words. Just after midnight, electricity coursed through her body. 10 minutes later, she was pronounced dead. She was the first woman executed in Alabama since 1957, and the only person in the United States in 2002 to die by electrocution. Lynda's story raises difficult questions about justice, ideology, and trauma. Was she a hardened extremist who chose defiance at every turn, or a damaged woman whose mistrust of authority sealed her fate? Her silence in the final moments left no answers, only a lingering reminder of a life consumed by conviction and the irreversible consequence of capital punishment. Number 11, Lois Nadean Smith. Lois Nadean Smith was born on July 19, 1940 in Oklahoma, though most public records refer to her by her middle name, Nadean, at the time of the crime and arrest. In July 1982, she was 42 years old. Community members remembered her as a strong-willed mother, fiercely protective of her teenage son, Greg. She had worked various jobs locally and was known as a single parent struggling to raise her child alone. Beneath that surface, however, was a woman shaped by hardship, suspicion, and growing resentment toward anyone she saw as a threat to her family. Psychological assessments later pointed to unresolved trauma, a possible brain injury she suffered in her 20s, and emotional instability that worsened over time. Her defense attorneys emphasized a volatile personality, heavy substance abuse, and an obsessive maternal instinct that turned protective love into paranoia. By the summer of 1982, this fear had focused on one person, her son's former girlfriend, 21-year-old Cindy Bailey, on July 4th, 1982, in Sequoyah County, Oklahoma. Nadean and her son Greg and a friend picked up Cindy from a local motel. Cindy had reportedly threatened to harm Greg, an allegation that fueled Nadean's growing fears as they drove to Nadean's ex-husband's home in the small town of Gons. Tensions boiled over. Nadean began attacking Cindy in the car, first choking her, then stabbing her. The violence continued after they reached the house. Nadean forced Cindy into a chair, confronted her at gunpoint, and opened fire. Greg, caught up in the chaos, helped reload the weapon as the shooting continued. Witnesses later described Nadean laughing and stomping on Cindy's neck in a frenzied state before firing again. The young woman died from multiple gunshot wounds and stab injuries, violence fueled by fear and rage that spiraled far beyond control. In the aftermath, Greg fled the scene and was later arrested and sentenced to life in prison for his role in the killing. Nadean remained at the home and was taken into custody soon after. She admitted to the killing during interrogation, appearing unnervingly calm, yet resolute, convinced she had been protecting her son from danger. Prosecutors portrayed her at trial as a cold and calculating woman who viewed anyone close to her son as a threat. They relied on eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and Greg's statements to reconstruct the killing. The defense countered with evidence of her mental health struggles, her brain injury, and a long history of substance abuse, arguing she had acted irrationally driven by delusional fear rather than premeditated malice. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder and in December 1982 sentenced her to death. Nadean spent nearly 19 years on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Appeals centered on her mental health and head injury, but ultimately failed. In 2001, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board narrowly voted against clemency, sealing her fate. On December 4th, 2001, at age 61, Lois Nadean Smith was executed by lethal injection. She made no special request for a final meal. In her final statement, she expressed remorse and faith, saying she was sorry for the pain she had caused, asking for forgiveness, and quoting scripture, "To live is Christ, to die is gain." Thank you, Jesus. She thanked her attorneys and sent her love to her children. She was pronounced dead at 9:13 p.m., becoming the third woman executed in the United States that year. Experts who later examined her case described a complex psychological profile: maternal love twisted into obsession, impaired impulse control, and paranoia sharpened by substance abuse and trauma. Some viewed her as a tragic figure whose protective instincts became catastrophic. Others saw her as fully responsible for a brutal and deliberate act. Lois Nadean Smith's story forces a haunting reflection. Can love, warped by fear and untreated pain, lead someone to commit the unthinkable? Her quiet apology in the execution chamber lingers as a chilling reminder of how devotion and violence can tragically intertwine and of the irrevocable consequences that follow. Number 12, Marilyn Kay Plantz. Marilyn Kay Plantz was born on January 2nd, 1961, and raised in Midwest City, Oklahoma. At the time of her arrest in 1988, she was 27 years old and a mother of 2 young children. To her community, Marilyn appeared caring and devoted, juggling work and motherhood in suburban Oklahoma, though few knew of her secret dissatisfaction with her marriage or her growing desperation for financial stability. Psychological evaluations later pointed to intense insecurity and feelings of entrapment within her marriage to James Jim Plantz, a pressman at a local newspaper. Marital strain centered on money problems, long hours, and emotional distance. Marilyn's behavior became more erratic over time, displaying mood swings, secretive phone calls, and a fixation on securing insurance money, perhaps as a misguided attempt at security for her family. In the early hours of August 26, 1988, Jim returned home from his night shift. He entered the Midwest City house while Marilyn and their children reportedly slept. Unbeknownst to him, Marilyn had invited 2 young acquaintances, her teenage boyfriend Clifford Bryson and his friend Clinton McKimble, to lie in wait. When Jim arrived, the 2 ambushed him with baseball bats, brutally beating him, before Marilyn instructed them to stage an accident by burning his body and his pickup truck. They drove him to a remote location, doused both man and vehicle with gasoline, and set them aflame. Bryson later testified that Jim was still alive when the fire began. Some of the most gruesome details remained outside courtrooms, but the fact was clear: this was premeditated murder for financial gain. The victim, James Plantz, a husband and father with no apparent enmity toward his wife. Marilyn's children slept in another part of the house, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Marilyn reportedly showed no outward grief after the murder. Instead, she attempted to clean the bloodstains and cover tracks back at home, suggesting composure tinged with cold practicality. Police investigation gained momentum when McKimble spoke to authorities, securing a plea deal in exchange for his testimony. Eyewitness accounts, forensic traces at both the house and the burn site, and testimony from Bryson, who later received a death sentence of his own, implicated Marilyn. She was arrested, tried alongside Bryson, and prosecutors portrayed her as the mastermind, a woman who lured 2 men to kill for her profit. During the trial, the prosecution highlighted her motive: life insurance worth approximately $300,000 and the deliberate nature of the ambush and disposal. Her defense cited emotional instability and alleged trauma, but no psychiatric conditions were officially diagnosed or formally presented in mitigation. Despite reconciliation attempts from her adult daughter and community members, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. Marilyn Plantz was sentenced to death, and her sentence was upheld on appeal. Marilyn spent more than 12 years on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. In that time, she became the second woman ever executed in Oklahoma's history since statehood. Advocates raised concerns about forensic evidence reliability, especially in light of independent reviews that later criticized key police lab testimony. Still, officials denied any clemency or delay. On May 1st, 2001, At age 40, Marilyn Kay Plantz was executed by lethal injection at McAllister. She was pronounced dead at 9:11 p.m. local time. She made a final statement before the drugs took effect. Addressing her family and close observers, she affirmed her love for her children, expressed Christian faith, urged others to be born again, and spoke of overcoming the world through love. Reporters recorded several sounds from her as the execution began, reflecting tension in those final moments. But no last meal was specially recorded beyond standard protocol. She thanked those present, including spiritual advisors, legal counsel, and witnesses. Psychological profiles drawn from her case suggest conflicting motivations, desperation, maternal concern twisted into a lethal calculation, and a fragile psyche driven by fear and perceived financial ruin. Experts disagree whether she viewed herself as sacrificing one life for her children's future or as exploiting her vulnerability for selfish gain. The involvement of young accomplices' substance use at the time of the crime and in her escalating emotional instability suggest a complex blend of premeditation and psychological fracture. In closing, Marilyn Kay Plantz's life poses a chilling inquest into how financial desperation, emotional turmoil, and fractured identity can merge into a calculated tragedy. Was she a mother who lost reason in a moment of crisis, or a coercive planner who manipulated others into murder? Her final words of faith and love seem to seek redemption in the face of irreversible judgment. Her execution stands as a sobering testament to one woman's descent into desperation and the fatal lengths she went to protect or perhaps save herself. Number 13, Wanda Jean Allen. Wanda Jean Allen was born on August 17, 1959, the second of 8 children in a poor public housing household in Oklahoma City. Her father abandoned the family when she was young, and her mother struggled with alcoholism, leaving Wanda to care for her younger siblings. At just 12 years old, she suffered a serious head injury after being hit by a truck, and a few years later, she was stabbed in the temple during a fight. Later evaluations revealed an intelligence quotient of 69 and evidence of brain damage that impaired her ability to process stress, think logically, and understand the consequences of her actions. These vulnerabilities would follow her throughout life. By 17, Wanda had dropped out of school. As an adult, she drifted between low-paying jobs, often seeking companionship, but struggling with volatile relationships. In 1981, she was involved in her first homicide shooting, her childhood friend Deidre Pettis, during an apartment dispute. Wanda claimed self-defense, but evidence suggested otherwise. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and served 2 years in prison before being released. Several years later, Wanda entered a relationship with Gloria Jean Leathers. Friends described their romance as passionate but turbulent, marked by frequent arguments and intense jealousy. On December 2, 1988, after a heated confrontation in a grocery store, police escorted the 2 women home. Later that day, Gloria allegedly attacked Wanda with a garden rake, prompting yet another argument. The situation escalated when Wanda followed Gloria and her mother to the police station. In the parking lot, Wanda pulled out a .38 caliber pistol and shot Gloria in the abdomen. Gloria died 3 days later in the hospital. Police quickly connected Wanda to the shooting. Witnesses at the station identified her, and the weapon was recovered. At trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a manipulative repeat offender who had already killed once before. They pointed to the earlier manslaughter conviction as proof that this was not an isolated incident. Wanda's defense claimed she acted in self-defense, citing Gloria's history of violence toward her, but the court barred testimony about Gloria's prior behavior. Crucially, her attorney failed to present evidence of Wanda's brain injury, low intelligence quotient, and cognitive impairments, which could have been mitigating factors in sentencing. In 1989, Wanda Jean Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Appeals centered on ineffective counsel and the failure to introduce her mental health history. Human rights advocates argued that executing a woman with significant cognitive limitations violated fundamental fairness. Despite these efforts, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals and the governor's office denied clemency. Public debate about her case intensified, highlighting issues of poverty trauma and inadequate defense in capital punishment cases. During her 12 years on death row, Wanda experienced a profound religious conversion. She became a born-again Christian and often prayed with fellow inmates and volunteers. Friends and spiritual advisors described her as soft-spoken, reflective, and eager to seek forgiveness for her past. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. She was 41 years old. Witnesses reported her calm demeanor as she entered the chamber. She declined to request a special last meal. In her final words, she quoted scripture, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." She smiled at her attorney and stuck out her tongue playfully, a gesture of defiance or comfort, depending on who witnessed it. At 9:21 p.m., she was pronounced dead. Psychologists continued to debate Wanda's case. Some believe she was a tragic figure whose traumatic brain injuries and intellectual disabilities severely impaired her judgment and should have precluded the death penalty. Others argue she was fully aware of her actions, pointing to the repeated pattern of violence in her relationships. The tension between these perspectives captures the complexity of her life, a woman both victim and perpetrator, shaped by hardship, yet capable of harm. In the end, Wanda Jean Allen's execution forces reflection on the intersection of trauma, mental illness, and justice. Her final words of forgiveness echo beyond the prison walls, challenging us to question whether society failed her long before she failed herself. Number 14, Christina Marie Riggs. Christina Marie Riggs was born Christina Marie Thomas on September 2nd, 1971, in Lawton, Oklahoma, and raised in Oklahoma City. By the time of the crime in November 1997, she was 26, married with 2 small children, and working as a licensed practical nurse. To neighbors, she appeared responsible and caring, juggling motherhood with the demands of her job and financial strain. Beneath that surface, Christina struggled with a history of sexual abuse in childhood, early substance use, teenage pregnancy, and deep emotional pain. After high school, she earned her nursing license and worked first in home health care and later in a Veterans Administration facility in Oklahoma City, though she was never officially deployed to treat victims of the 1995 bombing. She later moved to Arkansas and joined the staff at a local hospital. Friends noted she suffered from chronic depression trauma and low self-esteem. Psychological testimony during her trial cited major depressive disorder, suicidal ideation, and possible post-traumatic stress. On the night of November 4th, 1997, Christina rigged a tragedy in her small Sherwood, Arkansas apartment. She gave her 5-year-old son, Justin, and 2-year-old daughter, Shelby, sedative antidepressants. Then, injecting potassium chloride she stole from her hospital, she administered it to Justin, but undiluted it burned and caused him pain rather than quieting him. Attempting to relieve him, she injected morphine. When he continued to cry, Christina smothered him. She then smothered Shelby without attempting injection. After laying the children in bed, she wrote a suicide note, took 28 antidepressant pills, and injected herself with potassium chloride expression of a plan to join her children in death. The next morning, her mother found Christina unconscious and the 2 children deceased. Christina survived but was arrested. She waived her right to remain silent and gave a tearful confession that afternoon. In that 8-minute recorded statement, she appeared confused, crying, and sometimes hallucinating her emotional state, raw and unstable. Charged with 2 counts of capital murder, Christina initially entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, but when the jury voted guilty in June 1998, she silenced her defense counsel and refused mitigation during sentencing. She told the jury, "I want to die. I want to be with my babies." The prosecution argued she killed her children because they had become burdens, that she planned their deaths over weeks, and that smothering them was deliberate. Still, psychological experts testified that Christina's actions stemmed from pathological suicidal depression, a mindset where ending her children's lives appeared to her as an act of mercy. The jury recommended the death penalty in less than an hour of deliberation. She became the first woman sentenced to die in Arkansas in modern times, and her conviction was affirmed on appeal. Despite public appeals from advocacy groups citing her mental illness and history of trauma, Governor Huckabee denied clemency. Christina declined further appeal, asserting she understood fully and accepted her fate. During her confinement at the McPherson unit, she reportedly remained quiet and distant. She received occasional visits from her mother and a few supporters. She displayed little resistance to her sentence and expressed a steady conviction that death was her only relief. On May 2, 2000, Christina Marie Riggs, age 28, was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins unit in Arkansas. As she was strapped to the gurney, she delivered a final statement. "There is no way words can express how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies. No way I can make up for or take away the pain I have caused everyone who knew and loved them." A moment later, she whispered, "I love you, my babies." She asked for no special meal and offered no additional words. Christina Riggs was the fifth woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 and the first in Arkansas since 1845. She remains the youngest woman executed in modern United States history. Psychologists and advocates have since debated her level of responsibility. Some point to her documented depression, childhood trauma, and impaired impulse control, arguing she viewed the act as tragic mercy and that her decision to die was rooted in unbearable guilt and despair. Others maintain that regardless of her mental state, she planned the act, deliberately stealing hospital drugs and concealing the medicine ahead of time, demonstrating a chilling calculation beyond self-destruction. In the end, the case of Christina Marie Riggs forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Can depression become lethal in its desperation? Is it possible for maternal love, distorted by despair, to lead to catastrophe? Her final words linger. They echo remorse, faith, and unbearable grief. Christina took her children with her in death and asked nothing but to join them, leaving behind a haunting legacy of love and loss, mental illness unaddressed, and irreversible finality. Number 15, Betty Lou Beets. Betty Lou Beets was born Betty Lou Donovan on March 12, 1937 in Roxborough, North Carolina. Her childhood was shaped by hardship and trauma. She lost her hearing to measles as a child and later alleged she suffered sexual abuse by her father. When her mother was institutionalized, Betty became the caretaker of her younger siblings, forced into adult responsibilities far too soon. As an adult, she worked sporadically as a cashier and waitress, marrying multiple times and raising 5 children. To those who knew her, she seemed resilient and stubborn, though behind closed doors, her life was marked by chaos and abusive relationships. By the time of her arrest in 1985, Betty was 48 years old, a grandmother and mother of 5 with a history of tumultuous marriages. 2 prior husbands had survived violent encounters with her. One was shot, another was run over by her car. Both incidents hinted at the volatility that defined her relationships, but did not result in convictions. Her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, would become the center of the crime that sealed her fate. On August 6, 1983, Betty reported Jimmy Don missing from their home near Cedar Creek Lake in Henderson County, Texas. Hours earlier, she had told her son, Robert, to leave the house because she planned to kill his stepfather. When Robert returned, Jimmy Don was dead shot twice. Betty instructed Robert to help bury the body in a small wishing well in the front yard. The next day, she staged an accident by placing Jimmy Don's heart medication in his boat and abandoning it on the lake, leading authorities to believe he had drowned. For nearly 2 years, Betty's story held. But in 1985, investigators received information that led them back to the Beets property. There, they unearthed Jimmy Don's remains, and to their shock, discovered the body of another former husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, buried in a different part of the yard. Both men had been shot with a .38 caliber pistol. The investigation revealed Betty stood to gain financially from their deaths through life insurance policies and retirement benefits. Betty was arrested and charged with capital murder. Her trial began in July 1985. Prosecutors portrayed her as a calculating killer, motivated by financial gain, while her defense claimed she was a battered woman driven to desperation by years of abuse. The jury saw otherwise. They convicted her of Jimmy Don's murder in October 1985 and sentenced her to death 3 days later. Prosecutors chose not to pursue a separate trial for Barker's murder, citing the existing death sentence. Betty spent more than 15 years on death row at the Mountain View Unit, a facility that housed Texas's female death row inmates. Her appeals argued that the jury had not heard the full extent of her abusive past and that crucial mitigating evidence was excluded. Supporters claimed she embodied the failures of a system that neglected to account for trauma and long-term abuse. Opponents saw a clear pattern of premeditated killings and manipulation. Court after court upheld her sentence, and the governor ultimately denied clemency. On February 24, 2000, at age 62, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She declined a special last meal and gave no final statement. Witnesses described her as quiet and expressionless as the drugs were administered. At 6:18 p.m., she was pronounced dead. Her ashes were later scattered over her mother's grave, honoring her final request. Betty Lou Beets became the second woman executed in Texas since the death penalty's reinstatement and one of the most infamous so-called Black Widow cases in American history. Her life and death remain the subject of debate. Was she a victim shaped by decades of abuse, or a manipulator who used that narrative to mask calculated murder? The silence she carried to her grave leaves no easy answers, only the chilling reminder of how trauma and desperation can collide with irreversible consequences. Number 16, Judias Anna Lou, Judy Buenoano. Judias Anna Lou, Judy Buenoano, born Judias Welty, on April 4, 1943, in Quanah, Texas, was arrested in January 1984 at the age of 40. She had worked as a nursing assistant and briefly ran a beauty salon. To those around her, she appeared to be a caring mother to 3 children and a devoted partner. But investigators would later uncover a darker truth, a pattern of poisonings and murders for financial gain that spanned more than a decade. Judy's early life was marked by hardship and abuse. Her mother died when she was only 4 years old, and she spent her childhood shuttled between foster homes and later living with her father and stepmother. She would later allege severe mistreatment, including starvation and physical abuse. At 14, Judy attacked her stepfamily with hot grease, which led to a stay in juvenile detention. By the time she left reform school, she carried both the resilience of survival and the scars of trauma. In 1961, she gave birth to her first child, a son named Michael. She married Air Force Sergeant James Goodyear and lived what appeared to be a stable family life. But when James returned home from Vietnam in 1971, he suddenly fell ill and died within months. His death was ruled natural causes at the time, but Judy collected life insurance benefits and moved on quickly, quietly changing her surname to Buenoano. Over the next several years, tragedy seemed to follow her. In 1978, another romantic partner, Bobby Joe Morris, died in Colorado after a sudden and unexplained illness. Soon afterward, Judy relocated to Florida with her children, including her teenage son, Michael. In 1980, Michael mysteriously became paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors later discovered he had been poisoned with arsenic, which damaged his nervous system. A few months later, Judy took him on a canoe trip. The canoe capsized and Michael drowned. Investigators later concluded the drowning was no accident. Judy collected $100,000 in life insurance following his death. Her crimes escalated in 1983 with her next partner, businessman John Gentry. He too fell ill after taking what Judy claimed were vitamin pills. He survived, but later a pipe bomb exploded in his car, an attempt on his life that he also survived. This incident prompted police to investigate Judy more closely. Forensic testing revealed the so-called vitamins were laced with toxic chemicals. Authorities exhumed the bodies of her late husband and previous partner and found lethal levels of arsenic. The pattern was clear. Those closest to Judy had died under suspicious circumstances, and she benefited financially each time. In 1984, Judy was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the murder of her first husband, James Goodyear, the drowning of her son Michael, and the attempted murder of John Gentry. In court, prosecutors highlighted the recurring pattern of poisoning life insurance policies and staged accidents. Her defense pointed to her abusive childhood and difficult life, but could not overcome the overwhelming forensic evidence. Judy was convicted of murder in the death of James Goodyear in 1985 and sentenced to death. She later received additional convictions for the murder of Michael and the attempted murder of Gentry, adding life and lengthy prison terms to her record. Judy spent nearly 14 years on death row in Florida. Appeals argued that her traumatic childhood and mental health issues warranted mercy, but the courts consistently upheld her sentence. Media coverage nicknamed her the Black Widow, emphasizing the cold calculation behind her crimes and the unsettling image of a mother who turned on her own son. On March 30th, 1998, at the age of 54, Judias Judy Buenoano was executed in Florida's electric chair. She declined to make a final statement, replying simply, "No, sir," when asked if she had any last words. Her final meal consisted of broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, tomato wedges, and hot tea with lemon. At 7:13 a.m., she was pronounced dead, becoming the first woman executed in Florida since the 1800s and the first in the modern era to die by electrocution. Psychologists remain divided on Judy's motivations. Some view her as a cold opportunist who systematically killed for money and freedom. Others see her as a deeply damaged woman whose traumatic upbringing and survival instincts warped into something deadly. Regardless of motive, the scope of her crimes, spanning a husband, a partner, her own child, and an attempted murder, remains chilling. Judy Buenoano's story forces us to confront haunting questions about human behavior, trauma, and justice. Can a lifetime of suffering ever explain the deliberate destruction of those closest to us? Her silence in death leaves those questions unanswered, a quiet but unsettling end to one of Florida's most notorious killers. Number 17, Karla Faye Tucker. Karla Faye Tucker was born on November 18, 1959 in Houston, Texas, the youngest of three sisters. By the time of her arrest in July 1983, she was 23 years old and working sporadically in unsteady jobs, living a lifestyle increasingly defined by drugs, men, and instability. Though many in her early life viewed her as troubled, dropping out of school at 14, engaging in substance abuse and prostitution, few could have predicted the violence she would later commit. She grew up in a fractured household. Her parents divorced when she was 10. A troubled mother and a distant father left her emotionally adrift. By early adolescence, she was exposed to sex, drugs, and crime, and had drifted into destructive behavior. She married briefly at 16, then fell into the company of biker gangs and drifters. By 1983, she was dating Daniel Garrett, and the pair began a crime spree fueled by drugs and desperation. On June 13th, 1983, in Houston, Tucker and Garrett broke into the apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Thornton, intending to steal a motorcycle Dean was restoring. Under the influence of methamphetamine, events turned brutal. Garrett first attacked Dean with a hammer, then Tucker picked up a pickaxe and struck him repeatedly. Discovering Thornton hiding under covers, she then hit Thornton with the pickaxe until deadly injury occurred. The violence was shocking in its intensity, and Tucker admitted afterward that she felt an intense orgasm with each blow, a chilling detail that underscored emotional detachment and trauma-driven rage. Police captured them about 5 weeks later. Witnesses' stolen property and physical evidence led to their arrest. Garrett's defense collapsed under the weight of forensic proof, and Tucker was charged with capital murder for the deaths of both Dean and Thornton. In her trials, she pled not guilty and later testified against Garrett in exchange for a reduced charge for Thornton's death. Prosecutors painted her as a ruthless accomplice intoxicated by violence and lacking remorse. At trial in 1984, Tucker stunned observers when she testified with composure but minimal emotion. She declared that her crimes were committed during a drug-induced haze, yet acknowledged responsibility. The jury convicted her on both counts. She was sentenced to death in late 1984, the first woman sentenced to die in Texas since the Civil War, and one of only 2 women ever executed in the state in the modern era. While on death row, Karla Faye Tucker underwent a profound transformation. In October 1983, she became a born-again Christian, immersing herself in Bible studies, prison ministry, and eventually marrying her prison minister by proxy in 1995. Her letter writing and emotional sincerity won support across political and religious lines. Televangelists, international religious leaders, and even former opponents petitioned Texas Governor George W. Bush for clemency. But despite her conversion and public remorse, clemency was denied, and her appeals were repeatedly rejected. Media coverage was intense and polarized. Some branded her the pickaxe killer, while others lauded her spiritual journey and saw her as a case for redemption. The debate around her execution became emblematic of the tension between retributive justice and the possibility of human change. On February 3, 1998, at age 38, Karla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She requested a final meal of a garden salad with ranch dressing, a peach, and a banana. When asked if she had any last words, she said, "No, sir," simply. As the lethal injection proceeded, witnesses observed her praising Jesus, humming softly, licking her lips, looking upward as if praying. She was pronounced dead 8 minutes after the drugs began. Tucker was the first woman executed in Texas since 1863 and the first woman executed in the United States since 1984. Her death sparked widespread discussion about the death penalty, gender, and capital punishment, and the possibility of moral redemption. Officials overseeing her execution later expressed regret, with one inmate handler resigning, citing the emotional toll of her presence on death row. Psychological assessments of Tucker's case are divided. Some experts view her killings as fueled by long-term trauma, substance dependence, and deep-seated mental instability, suggesting she was an emotionally broken young woman. Others counter that her deliberate participation in violent murder, even while impaired, showed agency and brutality. Her conversion and remorse struck some as genuine. Others felt it served as a final performance. In closing, Karla Faye Tucker's life and death pose haunting questions. Can a person truly transcend violence through faith? Does redemption erase accountability? Her final moments, faithful, silent, and composed, leave a lasting impression. She transformed from a brutal convict into a symbol of spiritual awakening, yet faced execution nonetheless. Her story lingers as a stark reflection on justice, mercy, and the irreversible consequences of choice. Number 18, Margie Velma Barfield. Margie Velma Barfield, born Margie Velma Bullard on October 29, 1932 in rural South Carolina, grew up in a sharecropping family as the second of 9 children. Raised in a strict Pentecostal Christian household, she endured physical and emotional hardship and left school at 17 to marry Thomas Burke. To her neighbors, she appeared devout and hardworking, but beneath the surface was a woman shaped by trauma, poverty, and a lifetime of quiet turmoil. For 15 years, Velma lived what seemed a stable life, raising 2 children with Burke in North Carolina. But in 1969, tragedy struck. Thomas died in a house fire that also destroyed their home. Within months, she remarried only to watch her second husband, Jennings Barfield, die of heart failure a few years later. Soon after, her mother became gravely ill and passed away after a brief hospitalization. Each death appeared natural at the time, and no suspicion followed her. By 1975, Velma's personal struggles deepened. She served 6 months in prison for writing bad checks and emerged financially strained and addicted to prescription drugs, particularly Valium. She began working as a home health nurse for elderly couples in rural North Carolina. Over the next few years, people in her care, including Montgomery and Dolly Edwards and John Henry and Record Lee, died of sudden and unexplained stomach illnesses. In early 1978, her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, fell ill as well. After his death, an autopsy revealed arsenic poisoning. Investigators exhumed several previous victims and found the same toxin in their remains. Velma was arrested on May 13, 1978, and charged with first-degree murder in Taylor's death. During interrogation, she confessed to poisoning multiple people, including her own mother. She claimed her motive was not hatred, but desperation, often to cover up thefts she committed to fund her drug addiction. Yet prosecutors argued that the pattern was deliberate. She repeatedly poisoned those closest to her, often benefiting financially or avoiding discovery of her crimes. Her trial later that year focused on Taylor's murder. Prosecutors highlighted her history of suspicious deaths, the presence of arsenic and financial motives tied to stolen checks. The defense raised her long history of abuse addiction and mental illness, arguing she was not fully in control of her actions. The jury was unmoved. In December 1978, Velma Barfield was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, Velma underwent a profound religious conversion. She became a born-again Christian and devoted herself to ministering to fellow inmates and prison staff. Her newfound faith gained her support from high-profile religious figures and sparked widespread debate. Was this woman, now gentle and devout, the same person who had poisoned those in her care? Despite appeals and pleas for clemency, North Carolina courts and the governor upheld her sentence. By 1984, she had exhausted all legal options and accepted her fate. In her final days, she expressed deep remorse for her actions and asked forgiveness from the families of her victims. On November 2, 1984, just days after her 52nd birthday, Margie Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was the first woman executed by lethal injection in the United States and the first woman executed nationwide since 1962. She declined a formal last meal, but accepted a small snack of cheese doodles and a soft drink. In her brief final statement, she thanked those who had supported her and expressed sorrow for the pain she caused. She also requested that her organs be donated to help others after her death. Psychologists and criminologists remain divided on Velma's motivations. Some argue that trauma, addiction, and mental illness drove her actions, noting possible dissociative episodes and impaired judgment. Others see calculated behavior, carefully chosen victims, a clear financial pattern, and repeated concealment. Velma Barfield's story unsettles because it forces reflection on trust and betrayal. She presented herself as a caregiver and a woman of faith, yet secretly committed acts of quiet, methodical murder. Her redemption in prison raised hard questions. Can faith and remorse truly transform someone condemned for such acts? And should that transformation matter in the face of ultimate justice? In the sterile silence of the death chamber, her quiet apology lingered long after her life ended. Velma Barfield's case remains a haunting intersection of mercy, trauma, and accountability, a reminder that even the most ordinary faces can hide unfathomable darkness.